Hello and welcome to today's video where I am going to be making another Venom mask, but this one is a half mask. Well, not really a half mask, but you get the idea. Half the face is gone. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is cut out your patterns, and I decided to do the open side on the left side of my face, and the other side is going to be the full Venom side. So if this pattern does look familiar, it is based off of the original Venom pattern. So if you have that one, just take it and alter it on one side as you wish. This is just an example. A few things I did change was I did widen the back end on it, so it's a little easier to get on. And I did also shorten the jaw and put it up because I'm not going to put as many teeth or the tongue in it. I'm just going to have half of a face with mouth and all that, and the other half is going to be my face exposed. So, now that I've got my patterns cut out of 5mm EVA foam, I'm going to take some contact cement and spread it on each side of these V-cuts. So, as you'll probably notice, I am using the included brush. I am brushing it on each side, and you just need to get it even. If it's a little thick, that's fine. And once you get it applied to both sides, you have to let it sit for 15 minutes before you actually push both sides together so it will glue. It has to dry essentially on each piece and become tacky enough to stick to itself, if that makes any sense. And you'll notice I'm kind of just pushing the top piece out of the way as I brush it here so I can get a nice even amount. And if you happen to live in a more humid area, you may have to let it sit for 20 minutes or 30 minutes. But aside from that, 15 minutes is usually enough. Now, where I live is a very dry climate, and we don't have a lot of humidity, so 15 minutes, I'm never worried. And realistically, sometimes it is ready to go in 10, but I usually don't chance it. I'm careful. I have seen people speed this process up by putting it in front of a fan. I've seen people use a hairdryer to speed this process up. I don't recommend that because this stuff is flammable and highly toxic. So I am, of course, out in my garage with my door open, and I'm in a well-ventilated area. But you should also probably wear a respirator as well whenever you do this, just to be sure, especially if you're not an adult. And if you're not an adult, always get your parents' permission before using anything like this stuff. Okay, and now that I have glued all the V-cuts together, it's starting to give the mask a little bit of shape. Next, I'm going to take contact cement, apply it along the two inside seams, and glue the two halves together. Alright, I have glued the two center pieces together, and next I'm going to put contact cement from this point all up along this edge, all the way around, and it's going to stop at this corner here on both sides. And I'm also going to put contact cement on this piece as well. I'm going to start up here and go all the way around the edge down to where you see this small divot here. Right there is where it's going to stop. Alright, now that the shell has been put together, you'll notice, probably in particular at the seams and the V-cuts, there's some bumps and angled areas, and there's a way to smooth that out, and if you watch my other videos, you already know what it is. I have a canvas hat maker's mannequin head here. You don't necessarily need that, but you can use one. Or anything round, maybe even a melon. I don't know, anything round and solid. But what I do is I use a dual setting heat gun on the high setting, and I heat up the area that I need to round out, and then before it cools I will press and round that out. And that's not perfect, but for just one quick application, it is already starting to round out, at least in comparison to this side, where you can clearly see an angle. And here we're starting to get around its surface more so, but I am going to have to heat this some more and also sand out the rest of it. So I'm going to go ahead and continue to do this all over the mannequin head. Like right here you can kind of see there's an area that needs to be more round and not so pointy. I'm going to do that all over, everywhere that I don't like it, till I get this part all the way to the back of the mask nice and round. Okay, so I've got all this rounded out pretty decently, at least I'm happy with it. And I've also heated and rounded this part here, and rounded the eye up here, because the basic pattern as it is just kind of sticking out like a wing and looks kind of goofy. But I heated that and curved it, and heated this and curved it, and just basically rounded everything up. Did not do anything to the jaw. Then over here I started heating and shaping some of these symbiote pieces. This one I actually heated and curved in, and when I put this on, this actually butts right up against my cheek, which is kind of cool, like it's drawing away from my face. And also have not done anything to the jaw on this side. And same thing, just rounded out the back as much as possible, so that you don't have all those points and stuff that I had before, where it kind of blocked over, and the middle was a bit pointy too. So rounded all that off, and over here on this seam on both sides, there is, as you can see right there, still a bit of a bump, but that'll get sanded out, so I'm not going to heat that anymore. Next, I'm going to start heating and shaping the jaw. I don't want it as blocky as this, of course. I want it to look a bit more like that. Okay, finished heat forming it. This is all, of course, up to you how you want to do it, but I'm going to show you what I did, pretty much in the order that I did it. So first of all, I started by curving the jaw, heated it on the inside first, and put the curves in, and the bottom, you can see the curve, it kind of just follows this V-cut. And the centers, more or less, I left flat. And in the front here, I heated and put a little bit of a divot and dip right here in the center. That helped to straighten out the jaw, and at least in the front there, and make it look a little bit more jaw-like, which also in turn helped to flush out this natural curve that wants to go in it. And as far as the various symbiote pieces, I just kind of heated them and tweaked them how I liked, if that makes any sense, which I will be adding more later. But for now, I want those at least fleshed out and in place. Did of course curve the top lip as well pretty extremely, and on the sides, all I basically did was heated and pushed in a divot here, heating the inside first and pushing in, then heating the outside and pushing it in, and did a similar one right here. This is to make it look more like there's an actual jawbone structure, if that makes sense. And did the same thing on this side as well. Divot, divot. That's pretty much it, aside from just rounding everything out. Oh, I did heat, lastly, almost forgot, I did take and heat this area here on either side of the eye, and just pressed it in a little bit to give it the appearance of a temple. Kind of like your temples on your own head. Next, I'm going to go on and, whoa, thunder and lightning. Maybe I won't do this next, but the next clip will be me using my Dremel rotary tool to sand out all these seams. Okay, I finished my sanding, and obvious stuff, of course, I did the seams, but I also sanded around the eye to round it out a bit, and followed through on a couple places just to give it a little bit more definition and depth, and also sanded around the lip area so that it doesn't look so much like a square cut piece of foam, but more like something that rolls over into it. Followed that around as well. The trickier areas that I was like, initially I thought I couldn't sand at all, was right in through here. And some of them I was able to get pretty deep and get a nice shape out of it, but other areas, like where it's thin, you really can't sand it with a Dremel. It's just borderline impossible, but these in-between spots I did, along with rounding out the jaw here. Okay, so I took a piece of scrap EVA foam and glued it inside on the jaw, on the side where the face is missing, because there's not much here, and I don't want this to lose its shape or to sag, especially whenever I start putting teeth and gums and all that stuff over here. Which brings me to the next part. I have cut the lower and the upper gums out of some 2mm EVA foam, and I'm going to glue them in using contact cement, and I'll come back and show you what that looks like. Alright, I have the gums glued in, and I also made a little mouth corner piece. It's not necessary. I didn't do it in the other Venom, but I wanted to do it in this, and what I did was I took a scrap piece of 2mm EVA foam, and I heated it up, and then squeezed it together real tight. This is the scraps from it. And once I had that wrinkled shape, I just trimmed off the excess until it fit, and then pushed it in place and put some super glue around it while I held it in place and let it sit and dry. Next, I have to start making a ton of teeth, and here's one that I've already finished. And I heat this and pinch it into shape with my fingers and kind of pull it so it gives it a bit of a curve. And how I heat it is I use a push pin to put my toothpiece hanging off the end of a piece of foam, and I get it hot, and then I immediately squeeze it with my fingers to give it that shape. Okay, so as far as the teeth go, you can see here I've already started gluing them in. I don't actually use contact cement. I just use some super glue. This happens to be Crazy Glue brand, but you can use pretty much whatever. And what I do is I take my tooth, and on the end I want to glue, I just put a little drop, because this stuff is very thin and very liquid, and whenever I go to push it in, it will spread out to an extent. And I just find my socket and my gum where I want it, and then I press it in pretty firm to the point that you can see I'm actually like warping the mask to an extent. This is so that it will create ridges in the gums where the teeth are being attached. And as far as what I do with the length of teeth and how I position them, the positioning is pretty random. It kind of happens as I go along. Like you can see, this one's kind of sticking out a little snaggle tooth. I am going to put a second row in behind some of these, okay? But you don't want them too standard. You want them kind of random. You can always go back with a little heat later on individual teeth and move them if you want. Staggering them always looks good as far as whether they're going out or more back. But my general rule of thumb for the front is I put the longest ones here, and they get smaller. Right about this one will basically represent the canine, and they'll start to get smaller and shorter as they go back. Same thing with the front. They're relatively short here. I peak them up a little bit around the canines, and they start getting shorter all the way to the back. Okay, I have the teeth in, and as you notice, I have a few random ones here and there. And like I say, I'm going to stagger and put some more in the bottom, pretty much just behind some of these to fill in some space, like where there's some gaps and stuff, and just to make it look like there's more teeth, like a shark, or, you know. And after I've done that, and my weird little wonky teeth that I have kind of glued in here sporadically, I took hot glue and went all over the teeth. just to make sure they're not going anywhere. And this actually serves a secondary purpose as well. It will help stiffen up the mask, because the more stuff like the plexiglass for the eye or anything else you're going to glue into here is going to add weight to it. Okay, and that weight is going to cause the mask to want to flatten down. Now, it's not such a big deal if you're storing this for like display and you have it on a mannequin where all the weight is being supported underneath in this area of the mask. But if it just sits there, the weight of it is going to cause it to smush down. So that's the other reason why I do it. And kind of the same concept as this blue scrap piece that I glued in over here is to help the mask hold its shape. Because even if you're not heating it or you've stored it in a relatively climate controlled and safe environment, the issue still becomes that gravity and time is going to pull that mask down. And even though you're not heating it, it's going to go out of shape. And if you'll notice, when I push on it, right in here flexes a lot. So that's probably the next place I'm going to cut to shape a piece of scrap EVA 5mm and glue that in with some super glue to help stiffen that up and hold it in place. Okay, and I ended up actually putting 2 pieces of EVA foam inside and then hot gluing around it. I put in the top one first, this one up here around where the eye is, which then created actually a weak spot in between the bottom piece and the top piece. I had to put a second one in, and then as you can see, just hot glued around it, and that helped to make the mask much more stable and steady. And of course, as the hot glue was cooling, I was holding the mask in place to make sure I didn't deform it, to make sure that both the bottom and top seam line in the center here line up and it keeps the shape that I want and all that good stuff. Alright, next I'm cutting out some of these weird squiggly pieces. So the first thing I do is cut out the basic shape, okay, which you can see is flat. And if I glued it on, it would stick straight off the face and look ridiculous. So the next thing I do is I take some scissors and I trim this at an angle, very carefully with razor sharp scissors, by the way, and then trim it down a little more and trim off the edges. And this is kind of rough here, unfortunately, on this edge, but at least it's on the inside. I have trimmed away the sharpness of the edge with the scissors on all 4 sides. After that, I use my heat gun and get it hot, and then I smooth that out as even as I can to a sharp point. And then same thing, I'll heat up this other half of it and I'll round that out as much as possible with my fingers so it doesn't just look like a square piece of foam that you cut out. And then lastly, I use super glue to glue it on. And you'll notice, like with this piece here, it doesn't look out of place really where it did whenever I first put it on before actually doing the heating and rounding like I did here. It looked pretty bad. So I do recommend trying to get it as round looking as possible so it doesn't just look like a hunk of EVA foam. And then after all this is said and done, whenever I silicone over the seams to try to get rid of them as much as possible, I'll also blend this in as well, where all these are attached. And you can kind of position these wherever you want. Kind of have them just sticking out. You can then heat them and curve them in, or curve them out, or curve them down, or curve them up, or do whatever you want. Or just kind of stick them wherever. Okay, I now have all my little pieces glued on. I didn't use all the ones that I came up with, but I did use a bunch of them. Like this one, for example, I heated and twisted a little bit. This one here, I totally spiraled, coming out over this joining piece. And yeah, just kind of randomly put them on as I thought I would like. Oh yeah, and then heated and twisted this gum piece around just for to be different and comedic effect. I don't know. But now I'm going to start covering up the seams, and what I'm going to use for that is DAP all-purpose acrylic latex caulk plus silicone. The main thing to remember here is acrylic, which means that when you put it on, you can smooth it out with your finger and some water. The other good thing about it is, since it's acrylic, if you want to add color to it, like this one here, you can see kind of has this pinkish hue. before it's dried. Once it's dried, it'll be a blood, somewhat translucent red. The only nice thing about the paint is it can match whatever you're doing, or in this case, it'll go from this color to a translucent blood red, which lets me know essentially that it's dry. So how I apply this is, obviously first, I squeeze it out of this. Like I say, you don't need to do that, but I just like applying it with my finger. I think that's the easiest way. And this stuff you cannot sand. There is a fast dry version, which you can sand, but I think it's ultimately easier to get this stuff. You don't even have to sand it. If you can get it smooth enough, whenever you do it, there's generally no need for sanding. Okay. So once I've done that, I kind of dip my finger into some tap water, also to clean off the excess. Then I will take my wet finger. You see how bumpy and lumpy it is. I will begin to smooth all that out. And the excess water I just kind of spread out. And I will repeat this process for joining pieces, seams, basically anything I want to cover up, like these areas here. I've basically joined everything together. You don't want to see the seams if you can help it. And depending upon how humid it is where you live, it can take an hour or two to dry, sometimes longer, and that also depends on how thick it is. Like I say, the nice advantage of adding either dye or paint is that I have a much better indicator, or litmus test, or whatever you want to call it, for it being done or not. Okay, I have finished with covering the seams and all that, and blending in like these pieces. And it took several applications, at least 2 to 4 layerings, because first of all, the foam is porous, so it does absorb the DAP acrylic latex plus silicone. And it's also water-based, so as the water evaporates, it shrinks. So you still end up seeing the divots a little bit, so I have to go over a few times until I can get it smoothed out. And then I also took and put some wrinkles around the eyes, just using hot glue. The taller wrinkles, like right here above the eye, I put a couple layers to get that tall and just kind of built up. But it still looks a bit obvious and obnoxious. What I'm going to do next is use some of the same silicone that I used to seal and hide all the seams to blend in these wrinkles a bit and even them all out. And I also took and put some random veins here on the back as well. Okay, so I've finished up with my siliconing, like I say, if nothing else, just to help blend all this in. So it's a little more gradual, looks more like bunched up skin instead of just a blob of hot glue. And checked everything, glued a couple of 5mm pieces in the jaw just to help everything stay nice and firm after I had the teeth in. And yeah, now I'm ready to seal this thing and paint it. Put in the lenses, finish this up, and see how it looks at the end. And to seal this, I'm actually not going to use Plastidip. There's a lot of nooks and crannies on this where I'm afraid the Plastidip won't reach. So I'm going to actually seal it by hand, just using some Mod Podge. About the same cost, because this is what, $8.99 as getting a thing of Plastidip. But this does go a bit further, so it helps to save money. But also, since I've done so much siliconing, and you can see the grain from that. I'm going to use the brush strokes and follow that grain, and also the grain of the wrinkles and things like that, to help it give it a symbiote look anyways. Sometimes the plastic kind of dries and has kind of a pebbled, almost leathery look. I don't really want that. Alright, I've given it a few hours to dry, and I did put several coats. In some areas a little thicker, some areas a little thinner. But like I say, I kept the brush strokes going in one direction. And now I'm going to use some createx airbrush paint. This is opaque black, and I'm going to basically use that to primer the whole thing over my layer of sealant. Alright, now that my basic primer is done, I'm going to go ahead and start painting the teeth with a little bit of white. Of course, you can paint yours however you want, but as I point out using an airbrush, that the tips are much more white and the bases are much less white. I kind of fade it from bright white down to a darker white. Now that the white is dry, I'm going to add a little bit of yellow just to give it a bit of a black effect. Okay, and you'll probably notice I focused most of the yellow up towards the top, where I left a lot of the black showing through. Okay, and lastly I mixed together some red and white to make this kind of ugly bubblegum pink color. But by putting it on relatively thin, leaving the black show through, looks pretty good, I think at least. I did it a little thicker where the center of the tooth would be, just so you kind of have highlights and lowlights. And sprayed in the side over here too. And then I went back through and cleaned up the black. Now, a real simple thing to do if you haven't used an airbrush before is just take a piece of scrap paper. And when you're trying to do individual pieces, you can just take said scrap paper and block off the stuff that you don't want to paint. And that's how I did these extended pieces. In fact, you can see the little marks. I pulled this one out that wraps around the tooth, painted it, put it back. And then since I have a dual setting airbrush, I can do thicker or thinner and just apply very carefully the pink. Then I went back through and covered up all the work I had done to turn all this black. And next, I'm going to let this dry and come back and hit it with some Mod Podge Super High Shine Clear Acrylic Sealer. I like this stuff because it is flexible. For example, the Rust-Oleum and stuff like this is meant for cars or for whatever. This stuff is more meant for something that's static. And what I mean is not going to flex or move. When this stuff dries, a lot of times it cracks. Whereas the worst I usually get from the Mod Podge, since it is flexible, or Treehouse also makes a great clear high gloss acrylic sealer. And the Treehouse also advertises that it protects against water and moisture, which I don't think this one does, actually. But it does have a more flexible coating than the Treehouse, but the Treehouse is pretty good. And that's why I like using that. Because when you're going to put this mask off and on, you're going to stretch it and move it. And each time you do that with the hardware store, so to speak, clear coats, for example, like I say, I end up getting a lot of cracks and spiderweb cracks and things like that because it's not meant to be flexed. It's meant to be a hard gloss coating. Alright, while my clear coat is drying, I'm going to go ahead and begin to cut out the eye shape, and I'm going to cut that out of 1/8" thick acrylic plexiglass. This is the same stuff that I used in the original Venom mask video, so I'm going to go ahead and cut this out off camera using a cutting wheel and my Dremel, and cannot stress enough the importance of eye protection. I've actually had some of these cutting wheels break. Not on this, but on other things. I probably shouldn't have been using it to cut with, but I still highly suggest that you always wear eye protection anytime you do something like this. And once I cut out the eye shape, I will then heat it with a heat gun, and using work gloves, I will curve it to get the shape, so it will glue into the mask a little better. Okay, I've glued in my plexiglass first, and to glue that in, I use some contact cement. Now, talk about this real quick. Contact cement will not permanently hold this in. It just basically holds it in place, if that makes sense, for the meantime. And if I were to push on it really hard or hit it, it'd probably pop out or at least come partially undone. That's because it's really notoriously hard to get anything to actually stick to plexiglass unless you use a similar type of plastic or acrylic, and you're using some type of plastic weld like DevCon, which is expensive, and if it's bad, doesn't work, and also kind of unnecessary to spend the money or search down something like that for this. So what I do is first I contact cement this in to hold it in place. Next I have a lens here, not a lens, sorry, a piece of cloth here that I cut out to shape same as the lens. It's going to go on the inside first. I'm going to contact cement it in there, and then I'm going to have a secondary layer, simply because this is just too see-through, and you can totally see my eye through it even after I paint it. And that's what I'm going to do next. That's why I have it on this little rig I made here, which is just some foam with some pins stuck in it. And that keeps it up in the air and off of this so the paint can dry properly. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to airbrush it with some opaque white, and once that's all done, I will glue the final pieces of that in. And then I'll come back and show you what I do to actually make everything stay in place, which is hot glue. Alright, everything is now glued in, and I'll show you what I did with the hot glue. I basically just put a ton in there. Made sure it overlapped from the foam onto the actual lens itself and held everything in place. Haven't had them fall out yet with that, but just the contact cement will not hold it. And considering putting some black sheer cloth in here, let me go look and see what I have. Well, I didn't have any transparent black fabric, and I didn't really want to try to paint the other stuff and put it in, especially since I'm going to be breathing on it. I don't know how the moisture from my mouth is going to affect it. I did have some tulle, which is this stuff here. It's kind of a mesh net. And I put 3 layers of that in, but probably just going to have to go buy some black fabric. But for now, that's going to be it for the video. And all that's left to do is for me to go ahead and try this on. Okay, so that pretty much wraps it up for this video. Hopefully you've all enjoyed this build and this video. Maybe it gave you some ideas for a new project. And as always, thank you for watching. Initially, this had been mentioned and requested several times, both in comments on Instagram and here on YouTube, about having an exposed face. And then I saw a great post on Instagram where somebody actually took the pattern and did something similar to this. So I thought I'd do my own. I was finally motivated by that to just go out and do my own. And they're pretty awesome, so I'm going to link their Instagram below, so definitely check them out. It's Frank. And also Sugar Venom. Some great new music from her. I'll put a link to that as well below. And as always, thanks for watching. Have a great day. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and consider subscribing.